Welcome to our deep dive today. We're tackling a real head-scratcher from the headlines, a case that shook Jamaica and left a lot of people demanding answers. The death of businessman Keith Clarke. And joining me to dissect it all is expert speaker. They've got years of experience in expert speaker's background relevant to analysis could be law, forensics, investigative journalism, etc., which I have a feeling we're really going to need today.
Thanks for having me. This case is one of those where the more you learn, the less clear things become, but the details, those really stay with you.
It's not just about what the court documents say. It's about getting to the bottom of what happened to Keith Clarke. And we've got some court documents to help us do just that, with some pretty intense testimony. Ready to jump in?
Absolutely, let's get into it.
Okay, so rewind the clock to May 27, 2010. Jamaica's in a state of emergency. A full-blown manhunt for Christopher Dudas Koch, who, as many listeners may know, was a pretty notorious drug lord. Keith Clarke is at home. And that's when everything goes sideways. Expert speaker, set the scene for us. What was it like in Jamaica at the time?
The whole country was on edge. The manhunt for Dudas had really ramped up tensions, and there was this sense that anything could happen. Into this pressure cooker of a situation, you have security forces raiding Clarke's home.
The official story on the raid is, well, let's just say it's a little messy. But we've also got those eyewitness accounts from Clarke's family, his widow and daughter, who were right there during the raid. And their stories paint a very different picture.
They do. They say they saw him being shot in the back, coming down from a closet where he'd been, and that he was surrendering, that he wasn't a threat at all.
That's chilling. We've got the security forces version and then the family's account, which are already miles apart. And this is where it gets even more intense. We've got the former chief forensic pathologist's testimony, Dr. Dinesh Rao, who examined Clarke's body. What did he find?
It's tough to hear, but those details are really important. Dr. Rao documented 25 gunshot wounds on Clarke's body. He describes the damage as extensive, even going so far as to describe organs being split open by the bullets.
And this is where your stomach probably drops. Rao points out that most of those shots, they were to Clarke's back, which of course backs up what the family's been saying. 25 shots, most to the back. That's not just messy, it directly contradicts the initial narrative. So we're already dealing with conflicting stories, but then Rao takes it a step further, right? He goes beyond just documenting the wounds.
He does. He connects the dots, analyzes the trajectory of the bullets, the positioning of each wound, and uses all of that to give his expert opinion on how Clarke was likely positioned when he was shot. He even suggests that there's a good chance Clarke might have been shot while he was falling, which, if true, raises even more questions about how much force was used and why.
That's exactly right. And this is where the case starts to move from a tragic story to something that feels almost like a legal thriller. We've got this forensic evidence that is hard to ignore, and it leads us right to the courtroom.
Okay, so we're in the courtroom. What happens next? This is where those three propositions presented to Dr. Rao come in. Remember, we're talking about a prominent businessman killed in his own home. The Independent Commission of Investigations, or INDICOM, which is an independent body in Jamaica that investigates actions by the security forces, they wanted to look at every angle. They presented Dr. Rao with these three different scenarios, three different ways Clarke might have been killed, and asked for his expert analysis on each one.
Hold on, before we get to those scenarios, can you tell us more about why Indicom would even present these propositions? What's the strategy there?
It's about building a case, piece by piece. They're trying to anticipate the defense's arguments and poke holes in any alternative explanations. By presenting these scenarios to an expert like Dr. Rao, they're aiming to get his professional assessment on record, showing that the evidence points most strongly towards an unjustified use of force.
Got it. So it's like they're trying to cover all the bases, right? So they're not caught off guard later on.
Exactly.
Okay, so walk us through those scenarios. What were they, and what did Rao have to say about each one?
Right, so imagine this. You're Dr. Rao on the stand, and you're presented with the first proposition. This one suggests that Clarke was shot while he was firing at the security forces. Now remember, the bullet trajectory, the position of the wounds, all those details we talked about.
After 25 gunshot wounds, mostly in the back.
Yes. Rao, looking at all that, says it's simply not plausible. The evidence just doesn't support that narrative.
Okay, so that's one scenario down. What's the second one?
The second one proposes that Clarke was shot while facing the security forces and then turned around after being hit. Again, Rao pushes back, arguing that the sheer number of shots to Clarke's back makes this scenario highly unlikely.
So two scenarios down, and Rao saying the evidence doesn't fit. What's the final proposition?
This last one gets to the heart of what the family has been claiming. It suggests that Clarke was indeed shot from behind while he was surrendering. And here's where it gets even more compelling. Rao's analysis actually supports this proposition, stating that the evidence is most consistent with Clarke being shot while in a submissive position.
Which completely dismantles the narrative that he was resisting arrest or posing any kind of threat. This testimony feels like a game changer.
It was potentially huge for the prosecution. You have a respected forensic pathologist, someone who's seen it all, standing there saying that the evidence points towards an unjustified killing.
Right. It's not just anybody. This is the expert. But this is where it gets even more interesting. You'd think with this level of expert testimony, this case would be open and shut. But the defense, they don't just roll over. They try to discredit Rao's testimony.
They did, and they went after his credibility hard.
So how does that play out? What do they try to do?
Well, they brought up his history. You know, there had been some allegations of professional misconduct against him.
Okay, so they're trying to, paint him as unreliable?
Exactly. Trying to cast doubt on his whole testimony, make the jury question everything he said. And they didn't stop there. They brought in their own forensic expert, someone who would, offer a totally different take on the evidence.
Oh, so it becomes a battle of the experts then.
You could say that, yeah. But, and this is the key part, even with all that, the judge still allowed Rao's testimony to stand.
Which speaks volumes, don't you think?
It really does. I mean, it tells us that, in the judge's view, despite those attempts to discredit him, Rao's analysis was still considered credible, relevant.
Right. Wow. So we're talking about a case where you have the official story, and then you have eyewitness accounts and expert testimony that seem to directly contradict that story.
Exactly. And that's what makes this case, this whole thing, so significant. It raises these really uncomfortable questions about power, about accountability, about the use of force, especially in a climate as volatile as Jamaica was under that state of emergency.
Yeah, it makes you think, doesn't it? But the bigger picture here, this deep dive, I mean, it's been heavy, right? There's no way around it. It's about more than just one man's death. It feels like, it's a microcosm of some much larger issues.
It really does.
What are your final thoughts on all of this, expert speaker? What sticks with you, even after all this time?
It's easy to get lost in the legal back and forth, the technicalities of the case, all the different arguments. But at the heart of it all, it's about Keith Clarke, a man who died a violent and, from what we've seen, seemingly unnecessary death.
It's true.
And stories like his, they deserve to be told. They force us to confront those difficult truths about how power operates, how justice is served or not served. And they demand better from law enforcement, from governments, from the systems that are supposed to protect us. It's a reminder that even amidst chaos, even in a state of emergency, every single life has value. Every life deserves justice.
That's a powerful thought to end on. Expert speaker, this has been an intense but crucial conversation. Thank you for taking us through it all.
Thank you for having me. It's important that we keep talking about these cases.
Absolutely. This case, even years later, serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the official narrative is only one piece of a much larger, more complex puzzle. And for you, our listener, we leave you with this. How do we ensure accountability when the ones accused of wrongdoing are the ones in power? What does justice look like, not just in a courtroom, but for families like Keith Clarke's, the families left behind to pick up the pieces? Keep those questions with you. This has been a deep dive into a tragic case, a case that continues to resonate today. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.